January 1944, 2:35 p.m. Washington, D.C. Deep inside a windowless, underground tactical demonstration room at the Navy Department. The air is so thick with tension you could almost hear a pin drop. B.F. Skinner, the renowned Harvard psychology professor, stands beside a bizarre-looking conical device. His knuckles are white as he grips the edge of the table. Sitting across from him is a row of high-ranking officials from the Office of Scientific Research and Development and Navy admirals, men whose shoulder boards gleam with gold stars. These men, who control the vast resources of the Second World War, are scrutinizing Skinner's secret weapon with a look that mixes confusion, mockery, and impatience. No one speaks. The only sound is the low hum of the ventilation fan, breathing like some giant mechanical beast. In the center of the room, a projector beams a harsh white light onto the metal shell known as the simulator. Inside that shell, there are no precision gyroscopes, no complex vacuum tube circuits. There is only a common gray pigeon, codenamed Alpha, stuffed inside. It wears a specialized sensor collar, its head fixed just inches away from a ground glass screen, waiting for the moment that will decide its fate. Skinner takes a deep breath, filling his lungs with the smell of ozone and machine oil unique to the lab. He knows the next 5 minutes will determine the life or death of a $25,000 defense project. More importantly, it will test whether humanity can convert raw biological instinct into the most lethal guidance component of a war machine. He skips the opening speech and simply nods to his assistant, heavily pressing the simulator's start switch. With the crackle of a connected current, the internal servo motors begin to whir, emitting a high-pitched whine. On the projection screen, a grainy black and white image appears, a model of a Japanese battleship bobbing in the waves. This isn't a static photo, it's dynamic footage, simulating the perspective of a missile in a high-speed dive. Every eye in the room is glued to that small monitor connected to the contact points on the screen in front of the Pigeon. The image begins to shake violently, simulating the instability of a missile in turbulence. The target battleship swings left and right, threatening to slide out of range at any moment. By the laws of physics, this bomb should miss its target by hundreds of meters, splashing harmlessly into the endless Pacific like so many wasted munitions of the war. But then, in that split second, something spine-chilling happens. The signal light on the monitor begins to flash wildly, a high-frequency pulse, 3 to 4 times a second. Alpha is pecking the screen like a maniac. Inside that claustrophobic dark metal capsule, the Pigeon Alpha sees the object he has been trained thousands of times to attack, a white triangular marker superimposed over the battleship. He doesn't know what war is. He doesn't know what the Axis powers are. He only knows that if he pecks the center of that image hard enough, food will drop down. His head moves like a piston, every peck landing precisely on the center of the battleship image. No matter how violently the picture shakes, his neck acts like the most advanced gimbal stabilizer, locking onto the target. The data stream shows every peck converting into an electrical signal, driving the control surfaces on the tail of the simulated missile. If the target drifts left, the Pigeon pecks right, and the servos correct the course. If it drifts right, he pecks left, snapping the trajectory back to center. The generals in the room involuntarily straighten their backs, uncrossing their arms. Their eyes betray a hint of disbelief mixed with fear. The battleship on the screen grows larger and larger, meaning the missile is closing in at high speed. No matter how much the simulated turbulence interferes, that ship remains pinned to the center of the crosshairs, as if choked by the invisible hand of the Reaper. With a simulated boom, the screen goes black. System readout: direct hit. Margin of error: 0.5 meters. A deathly silence hangs over the room for a full 10 seconds before a low murmur breaks out. It isn't applause. It is the shudder of facing the unknown. An admiral takes off his glasses, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. His voice is raspy as he points at the metal cone. "Are you telling me," he asks, "that our future guidance system is a bird stuffed inside a bomb?" Skinner replies with a poker face. "Not one bird, General. 3. To ensure absolute reliability, we use 3 pigeons in a democratic vote. As long as 2 peck in the same direction, the missile executes the command." This scene sounds like bad science fiction or the delusion of a mad scientist. But in the timeline of 1944, this was the most realistic, brutal technological choice the Allies faced. To make sense of this absurd image, we have to pull the camera back, up through the ceiling of the Navy building, across the vast Atlantic, and look at the smoke-filled battlefields of Europe to see the desperate predicament facing the Allied Bomber Command. From 1943 to 1944, the strategic bombing of Nazi Germany reached its climax. Thousands of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators swept across Europe like locusts every day, dropping tons of high explosives. In newsreels and propaganda posters, these raids were depicted as surgical strikes. The Norden Bombsight, the pride of the US military, was advertised as being able to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. However, the real battlefield data was a slap in the face, a sting felt by every air commander. According to declassified post-war analysis from the RAF and the US Army Air Forces, precision bombing was a complete lie. Under the gloomy, overcast European skies, amidst black clouds of flak and frantic interception by German fighters, bombardiers couldn't hold the Norden sight steady. Data showed that American bombers often had a hit rate of less than 20% within a 300-meter radius of the target. This meant that to destroy a single factory, bridge, or moving ship, the Allies had to launch hundreds of sorties and carpet bomb square kilometers of land. This wasn't just a waste of ammunition, it was a waste of life. Every failed run meant 10 crew members risking death to go up again. Every stray bomb risked falling on civilians, creating humanitarian disasters with no tactical value. Even more fatal was the challenge of hitting moving targets at sea. Against the agile warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, high-altitude horizontal bombing had a negligible hit rate. This forced the US to rely on dangerous dive bombing, where pilots had to fly through a wall of lead to release their payload at point-blank range, trading flesh and blood for accuracy. The military desperately needed a weapon that, once dropped, could see the target, think about its path, and correct its own errors. But electronic technology was in its infancy. Vacuum tubes were bulky, fragile, and generated immense heat. Radar systems were too heavy to fit into a bomb's nose cone. Infrared guidance was still stumbling in the lab, easily confused by sunlight. Engineers tore their hair out trying to design mechanical gyroscopes and timers, but against dynamic battlefield targets, these rigid mechanical devices were as useless as a blind man. It was into this massive chasm of technological anxiety that B.F. Skinner stepped into history. He wasn't a weapons expert. He didn't know aerodynamics. He couldn't even shoot a gun. But he understood one thing: control. Absolute control over biological behavior. To him, a pigeon wasn't a cooing bird that made a mess on park benches. It was a biological CPU with millions of years of evolutionary refinement, a highly developed visual system, and lightning-fast reaction speeds. It was mass-producible. Its visual recognition beat any optical lens of the time. Its motor coordination crushed any servo circuit. Most importantly, it was cheap, light, and in certain conditions, more reliable than a human. Skinner's logic was cold and simple. Since we can't build an electronic brain smart enough, why not use an existing biological one? We train dogs to clear mines, horses to charge into battle. Why not train pigeons to crash into battleships? This wasn't cruelty. It was the optimization of war resources. In Skinner's lab, this project, codenamed Project Pigeon, and later Project Orcan for organic control, wasn't treated as biology. It was strictly defined as organic control systems engineering. Back in that oppressive demo room, despite the simulator's stunning success, Skinner sensed something off in the general's eyes. It wasn't the joy of a breakthrough. It was a visceral, physiological rejection. One general whispered to an aide, "This is ridiculous. We're going to hand over a multi-million-dollar missile to a bird with a brain the size of a peanut." This deep-seated anthropocentric arrogance and the fear of biological machines became the biggest obstacle in Skinner's path, harder to overcome than any engineering challenge. But Skinner didn't back down. He pulled out a thick stack of data recording thousands of tests. He showed vibration tests where pigeons were strapped to centrifuges, enduring G-forces that would black out a human, yet still pecking the target accurately. He showed noise tests where 150 decibels of simulated cannon fire blasted the birds' eardrums. They didn't panic, but continued pecking like robots. Even in low oxygen and freezing temperatures, these soldiers trained by operant conditioning showed greater focus than human pilots. Skinner pointed to the charts, his voice calm but firm. "Generals, you don't need dignity. You need hit rates. This bird doesn't feel fear. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't think about its wife and kids back home. It just wants to peck that dot, because pecking that dot brings a reward. It is the perfect soldier." This demonstration was more than a tech showcase. It was a collision of two philosophies of war. One side stood for the traditional view of steel, gunpowder, and human dominance. The other represented a cold, behaviorist future where life is just a programmable component. In that dim basement, Skinner opened a Pandora's box, releasing not hope, but a mad concept of integrating biology into the control loop. And it all started years earlier, with a dangerous flash of inspiration as Skinner watched a flock of pigeons circling outside his window. If we zoom in to the microscopic level, inside the missile known as the Pelican, you would find a breathtaking masterpiece of steampunk engineering. The nose is a reinforced glass fairing. A lens system projects the outside view onto an internal ground glass screen. 3 pigeons are strapped into custom shock-absorbing mounts, arranged in a triangle. Each has its own screen. Their beaks are fitted with metal electrodes, or the screen uses a conductive coating. This isn't just watching. It is a deep physiological fusion. The pigeon's eyes become the missile sensors. Its neck muscles become the signal amplifier. Its brain becomes the fire control computer. To make these 3 pigeons reach a consensus, Skinner designed a brilliant democratic voting circuit. If one pigeon gets distracted or pecks off target, the signals from the other 2 override it. Only when at least 2 pigeons issue a peck command in the same direction do the missile's hydraulic valves open to turn the tail fins. It was an early form of redundancy tolerance, a luxury concept in electronic engineering at the time, but in a biological system, Skinner achieved it with a handful of corn. However, turning a peace-loving pigeon into a suicide bomber wasn't easy. Skinner's first challenge wasn't mechanical, but psychological. How do you keep a pigeon calm amidst the screaming roar of a missile launch? How do you stop them from flinching as the target rushes toward them? How do you ensure they don't get tired? Skinner applied the core of his life's work, reinforcement theory. He discovered that uncertain rewards create more obsession than fixed rewards. Through variable ratio feeding training, he pushed the pigeon's pecking frequency to the limit, turning the action into a compulsive neurological reflex that overrode the survival instinct. In the time to come, we will dissect every insane detail of this project. We will see how these pigeons in a Minnesota lab were modified, step by step, into emotionless guidance components. We will uncover the power struggles within the U.S. defense research establishment, who supported this madness from the shadows, and who fought tooth and nail to stop it. And we will witness how fate made its choice when this biological guidance tech met the budding technology of radar at the crossroads of history. This isn't just a story about pigeons. It is a war epic about how humanity attempted to harness nature's most primal forces for its most violent purposes. And at the start of this epic, all the bets were placed on 3 birds, stuffed into a cramped metal capsule, completely unaware of the destruction they were about to unleash. To truly understand why the military would even consider funding Skinner's seemingly insane pigeon project in the 1940s, we first have to touch the raw nerve of every Allied air commander. That nerve was called the Norden Bombsight. In the years leading up to the Pacific War, the Norden was considered top secret. Its classification was, at one point, higher than the Manhattan Project itself. This 50-pound mechanical computer, made of over 2,000 precision parts, was hailed as a miracle of modern engineering. Every bombardier who trained on it had to swear a solemn oath. If their plane crashed in enemy territory, they would destroy the site with their sidearm or a thermite grenade before saving themselves. The Nazis could not touch it. The propaganda machine fed the public a myth. With the Norden, our boys could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. But when the Iron Curtain of war finally fell, this $6,000 instrument, which cost as much as a suburban American home at the time, shattered against the brutal laws of physics and the chaos of battle. On paper, The Norden was perfect. It was an analog computer. The bombardier punched in altitude, airspeed, and bomb type. The system calculated the trajectory, accounting for wind and the rotation of the Earth, even linking to the plane's autopilot to hold the course. But in the smoke-filled skies of Europe, theory meant nothing. Imagine a B-17 over the German Ruhr Valley in 1943. The air is a web of exploding flak. Shockwaves toss the heavy bomber like a leaf in a hurricane. To work, the Norden needed absolute stability to perform a calculation lasting nearly a minute. But in combat, the plane's attitude changed every second. The bombardier, fighting hypoxia and temperatures of 40 degrees below zero, had to press his eye to the scope and try to keep a jumping crosshair on a blurry smokestack thousands of feet below. Then there was the weather. Europe was covered in thick clouds, and the Norden was an optical device. It had to see the target. If a cloud drifted by, this expensive computer became expensive junk. Post-war analysis, like the famous But report, revealed a shocking truth. In 1943, the circular error probable for American bombers was over 1,200 feet. That means less than half the bombs landed within a quarter-mile of the target. To destroy a bridge or a ship, the Allies were forced into the primitive violence of carpet bombing. Thousands of tons of explosives rained down, leveling farms, homes, and schools, while the strategic target often remained standing when the smoke cleared. It was inefficient, expensive, and cruel. Commanders realized a terrifying reality. Humanity had mastered the explosives and the delivery vehicles, but in the last mile of guidance, we were still in the Stone Age. We desperately needed something that could actively correct errors in those final, chaotic seconds. Meanwhile, far from the flak towers, in a laboratory at the University of Minnesota, B.F. Skinner was leading a revolution in precision control. But his medium wasn't steel, it was biology, and his battlefield was a small box known as the Skinner box. Skinner was the leader of behaviorist psychology. While others obsessed over Freud's theories of the subconscious and dreams, Skinner didn't care. To him, an organism was just a machine. He viewed the brain as a black box. We didn't need to know what was happening inside or what the animal was thinking. We only needed to control two things, the input and the output. Skinner believed behavior wasn't free will. It was determined by consequences. This is operant conditioning. If you can precisely control the consequence, you can program behavior just like writing code. Let's step into his lab to see how this theory turned a common pigeon into a biological circuit board. Rows of soundproof boxes line the room. Inside each is a hungry pigeon. There is a button or a lighted disc, and a food dispenser. At first, the bird pecks randomly, random noise. But the moment it accidentally hits the lighted disc, click, a food pellet drops. That is reinforcement. The brain makes a connection. Peck disc equals food. But Skinner didn't stop there. He began shaping the behavior. He stopped giving food for every peck. He demanded accuracy, then speed. Then, he made the disc move, forcing the bird to track it. He introduced visual recognition tasks, projecting circles, triangles, and squares. Peck the triangle, get food. Peck the circle, the lights go out. The training was terrifyingly efficient. In days, these birds became pattern recognition experts. Their eyes became focused and fanatical, glued to the screen, pecking like machine guns the moment the target appeared. Skinner found that a pigeon's visual processing speed far outstripped a human's. Their field of vision was wider, their reaction to motion sharper. Crucially, they lacked human emotional baggage. A human pilot shakes with adrenaline, fears death, or gets distracted by thoughts of home. A pigeon does not. Under Skinner's conditioning, the bird was reduced to a pure input-output device. Visual signal in, brain processing, neck muscle output. This was Skinner's organic control system. He realized he was holding the ultimate biological servo mechanism. In an era where computers were the size of rooms, a pigeon's brain was a supercomputer weighing less than a pound, capable of millisecond-level image processing, running on a few grains of corn. While the Norden site failed in Europe, Skinner had a radical realization. What if we shrink the box and put it inside a bomb? What if we replace the light disk with a live image of a battleship? What if we connect the pecking motion to the bomb's tail fins? This idea forcibly welded two different worlds together, the cold need for military destruction and the rational science of behavior control. Traditional engineers tried to mimic the brain with gears and vacuum tubes and failed. Skinner went the other way. He stripped the biological entity of its animal nature and installed it as a high-performance sensor directly into the machine's logic. In Skinner's vision, the missile of the future didn't need radar or heavy gyroscopes. It needed a plastic lens, some simple gears, and 3 trained organic pilots. This redefined the concept of precision. Accuracy no longer relied on mathematical perfection, but on a biological hunger for a reward. To prove it, Skinner began the preliminary experiments for Project Orkan. He didn't just train them to peck, he simulated hell. He spun pigeons on centrifuges to test their inner ear balance. He blasted them with recordings of explosions. The results shocked everyone. These things were built for war. One pigeon, codenamed Gunner, pecked over 10,000 times in a 45-minute simulation with an error rate of less than 1%. No human ace pilot could match that stability. However, technical success didn't grant him a pass. When Skinner took this data to the military, he faced deep-rooted bias. Generals measured power in tonnage and caliber. To them, pigeons were pests or messengers, not the brain of a superweapon. But the smoke of Pearl Harbor, the losses in the Atlantic, and the failure of the Norden site finally cracked the door open. The National Defense Research Committee was desperate enough to try anything, even something that sounded like a bad joke. That desperation gave Skinner his chance to push this monster, a hybrid of behaviorism and ballistics, onto the stage of history. So, on a morning in 1943, a truck loaded with dozens of combat pigeons and lab equipment drove out of the University of Minnesota, heading for a secret test site in Washington, D.C. Skinner sat in the passenger seat, clutching his notebooks with a religious zeal. He believed he was delivering a new era of warfare, an era of precise, biological cybernetics. But he didn't know that he was driving straight into a collision course with history, ethics, and the limits of what humanity was willing to do to win. In 1943, hidden within a nondescript annex of a General Mills flour mill in Minnesota, lay the most bizarre military production line in the world. There were no riveters working a busy assembly line, nor the sparks of welding torches. The air didn't smell of acrid cutting fluid. Instead, it carried a unique blend of machine oil, grain feed, and bird feathers. This was the heart of Project Pigeon, a grotesque workshop forcing the marriage of biology and mechanical engineering. Here, B.F. Skinner and his team were attempting to conquer the project's most challenging hurdle: how to physically embed a living, breathing pigeon into a cold, steel missile and translate its every peck into a lethal turn for tons of flying metal. To accommodate these special pilots, Skinner's team designed a brand new missile airframe, which the military codenamed the Pelican. The name wasn't random. The nose cone was abnormally large and bulbous, resembling a pelican's beak. This anti-aerodynamic design was a necessity. Inside that cramped conical space, they had to stuff a complex optical projection system, a set of pneumatic control valves, and 3 live pigeons. Let's strip down the head of the Pelican missile like a watch to see this cyberpunk-style internal structure. At the very tip was a pane of high-strength optical glass acting as a camera lens. It captured the outside world, whether the choppy ocean or a German industrial zone. Through a precise system of lenses and mirrors, these external images were projected onto a translucent ground glass screen inside the missile. For the pigeon, this screen was their entire universe. On the other side of the screen sat the restrained pigeons. Skinner discovered that for precise control, the bird's body had to be absolutely still, allowing only the head and neck to move. To achieve this, engineers designed a custom flight jacket. In reality, it was a kind of elastic straitjacket fashioned from old stockings. It wrapped the pigeon's wings and feet tight, allowing the bird to be slid into a metal rail mount like a bullet being loaded into a magazine. Locked in place at a 45-degree angle, with their eyes just inches from the glass, this posture, while bizarre, minimized internal organ damage from the shock of launch. The core secret of the system lay in the signal conversion mechanism, how to turn a peck into electricity. In early prototypes, Skinner tried putting conductive metal caps on the bird's beaks, but they fell off too easily. Finally, they developed a laminated screen technology. The screen was covered in a microscopic conductive grid, or composed of two conductive films separated by a tiny air gap. When the pigeon saw a moving target, like the silhouette of a battleship, it instinctively pecked at it. It was a brilliant servo feedback loop. If the target was dead center and the pigeon pecked the center, the circuit remained balanced and the missile flew straight. But if the target drifted to the top left of the screen, meaning the missile was veering off course to the bottom right, the trained pigeon would chase the target, pecking the top left. The conductive grid instantly sensed this off-center contact and generated an error voltage. This weak signal was boosted by vacuum tube amplifiers to drive the pneumatic valves in the tail. High-pressure gas pushed the servos, and the missile's fins corrected the course upward and left. As the missile turned, the target image slid back to the center of the screen, the pigeon pecked the center, the signal zeroed out, and the missile resumed level flight. This complex mechanical sequence happened in milliseconds, all triggered by a beak tapping on glass. But stuffing a pigeon in a box doesn't make it a qualified organic pilot. It had to undergo hellish special forces training. Skinner wasn't just a psychologist here, he was a ruthless drill instructor. The first challenge was focus. In combat, a missile might fly for minutes before impact. The pigeon had to stare at the screen and peck 3 to 4 times a second without stopping. A normal animal would stop once it got food or lost interest. So, Skinner played his ace card, the variable ratio schedule. This is the exact same psychological principle that makes slot machines addictive. In early training, every peck yielded a hemp seed. But soon, the rules changed. Sometimes the bird had to peck 5 times for a seed. Sometimes 50 times. Sometimes it got 2 seeds in a row. The pigeon never knew if the next peck would bring a reward. This massive uncertainty created a pathological obsession. Records show that under this schedule, pigeons entered a manic, trance-like state, pecking the screen like tireless pistons with rock-steady frequency. Even if the food stopped coming for a long time, they wouldn't stop working. This biological addiction mechanism solved the endurance problem. Next came anti-interference training. A real battlefield isn't a quiet lab. A diving missile screams through the air, surrounded by flak explosions and violent vibration. To simulate this, Skinner installed high-power speakers next to the pigeon boxes, blasting recordings of war and jet engines. At first, the noise terrified the birds into freezing, but Skinner insisted on feeding them only when the noise was loudest. Gradually, the pigeon's brain rewired. Noise equals dinner. Eventually, you could fire a gun next to them or bang the metal casing with a hammer, and the pigeon's head would remain as stable as a gyroscope, eyes unblinking, continuing the mission. Even more extreme were the G-force tests. A missile pulls massive gravitational force during launch and maneuvering. A human pilot blacks out, GLOC, above 9 GS due to blood draining from the brain. But pigeons? Skinner strapped them to modified centrifuges and spun them at high speed. The results stunned aviation doctors. Because pigeons are small and have short circulatory paths, their tolerance is incredible. Data logs showed that even at 12 GS or higher, while their bodies were pinned flat, their flexible necks still swiveled freely, pecking the rotating target with pinpoint accuracy. This meant the Pelican could perform violent maneuvers impossible for human-piloted aircraft, locking onto enemy ships trying to evade doom. However, a single biological unit always has a failure rate. A pigeon might get sick, have a stroke, or just get distracted by a loose feather. For an expensive missile, a single point of failure was unacceptable. So, Skinner introduced the engineering concept of redundancy, creating the famous 3-pigeon guidance system. In the finalized Pelican nose cone, 3 independent pigeon capsules were arranged in a triangle. Each bird had its own lens and screen, seeing the same target but operating independently. Their signals were fed into an analog voting circuit. The logic was simple and brutal. Majority rules. If Pigeon A and Pigeon B pecked left, but Pigeon C pecked right, the circuit automatically ignored C, obeying A and B to turn the missile left. If one bird stopped working entirely, perhaps dying during launch, the system remained functional as long as the other 2 worked. In extreme cases, If 2 failed, the system would switch to single-channel mode, letting the lone survivor take full control. This design showcased the ultimate rationality and coldness of Skinner's mind. He viewed living things as parallel battery packs, as replaceable logic gates. In the basement of the University of Minnesota, researchers screened qualified products day and night. They selected the fastest, most aggressive individuals from hundreds of street pigeons, assigning them numbers and files. The file cards had no names, only codes and stats. P302. Visual reaction time 0.15 seconds. Noise tolerance grade A, high aggression. From that moment, the chosen ones were no longer birds. They were stripped of the right to breed, the freedom to fly, and even the instinct to eat naturally. Their weight was kept strictly at 80% of normal to maintain maximum hunger. Their entire existence was condensed into that 2-inch square of ground glass. In an internal review in late 1943, Skinner showed a film clip. A pigeon, encased in the metal cone, faced a projection of a rapidly moving Japanese Zero fighter silhouette. The tracking capability was suffocatingly precise. No matter how the fighter rolled or dived, the pigeon's beak stayed magnetized to the cockpit canopy. The data recorder beside it danced wildly, logging a stream of perfect guidance signals. "This isn't training, this is programming," Skinner told the dumbfounded engineers, pointing at the screen. "We have written the code of death into its nervous system. Right now, this pigeon is 10 times more accurate than our best radar operator. Give it a bag of seeds, and it will sink an aircraft carrier for you. Is there any business deal better than this?" The system looked flawless. The mechanics were rugged, the signal conversion was sensitive, and the organic pilots were Spartan-trained and ready to die. In the lab, Project Pigeon's hit rate and jamming resistance crushed every electronic guidance alternative of the day. Everything was ready. All they needed was the east wind, the final authorization to push this into combat. However, Skinner was about to discover that while he had solved the biology and the engineering, he had ignored the most complex, unpredictable variable in the war machine: the psychology of the human generals controlling the budget. These men could accept thousands of soldiers dying on a beach, but they struggled to accept placing the hope of victory in the beaks of a few feathered animals. The lab doors were about to open, and these organic pilots were heading toward their final judgment. In a hostile conference room at MIT, what awaited Skinner was no longer an academic discussion, but a brutal strangulation involving dignity, prejudice, and the faith in technology. Early 1944. Cambridge. Boston. Along the banks of the Charles River, lights burn late into the night inside the Servo Mechanisms Laboratory at MIT. This building is the holy grail of control engineering in America. The air smells thick with ozone and burning solder. Working here are the world's smartest physicists, mathematicians, and electronic engineers. They speak in the language of Fourier transforms, feedback loop gains, and signal-to-noise ratios. In this iron temple ruled by cold vacuum tubes and oscilloscopes, B.F. Skinner and his cages of pigeons look completely out of place, like a circus act that has stumbled into an operating room. This test is the last stand for Project Pigeon. Despite the flawless preliminary trials in Minnesota, the High Command at the National Defense Research Committee remains deeply skeptical. They have transferred Skinner's team to MIT, ordering the renowned engineers there to subject this biological guidance system to a vivisection by the strictest standards possible. This is more than a technical test. It is a trial of war philosophy. On one side stands electronic technology, the future, though currently clumsy, expensive, and unreliable. On the other stands biological technology, primal instinct, cheap, precise, yet filled with uncertainty. The lab director, a famous cybernetics expert, eyes the metal cone codenamed the Pelican with suspicion. For a man used to describing the world with differential equations, handing over control of a missile to a bird with a brain weighing a few grams is an insult to physics. Engineers whisper jokes in the background. "Hey, if the missile misses, is it because the pigeon wanted to go home? Do we need to install a toilet in the warhead?" This dismissive humor spreads through the lab like a virus, eroding the confidence of Skinner's team. However, when the test actually begins, the laughter dies in their throats. The test rig is a flight simulator mounted on a massive hydraulic arm. The Pigeon is placed in the control capsule, facing a screen playing top-secret footage provided by the Navy. Film shot from a dive bomber targeting a decommissioned destroyer at a New Jersey range. Skinner presses the button. The simulator activates. The giant hydraulic arm begins to thrash violently, simulating the turbulence of a high-speed dive. Noise generators scream with static. But on the plotter in the control room, the red ink pen representing the missile's trajectory draws a suffocatingly perfect curve. No jitter, no lag, no overshoot. No matter how violently the target swings left or right on the screen, the Pigeon known as Subject 42 pecks the bridge of the destroyer with a steady frequency of 4 times per second. The servo motor feedback shows a signal delay of less than 0.1 seconds. The tracking error is less than 1% of the screen width. A senior MIT physicist, who had been leaning against the wall ready to laugh, slowly walks over to the plotter. He takes off his glasses, brings his face close to the paper, and traces that smooth curve with a trembling finger. He turns to Skinner, his face pale. "This is impossible for a biological reaction," he says. "This curve, it's too mathematical. How did you do it? What filter circuit did you put inside?" Skinner answers coldly, "No circuits, doctor, only hunger and conditioned reflexes." This is the terror of behaviorism. It strips the organism of all emotion and distraction, leaving only pure input and output. Over the next few days, this shock is repeated throughout the MIT labs. The data is irrefutable. Compared to the early radar seekers being developed at the time, the Pigeon's anti-jamming capability is absurdly high. Radar waves get reflected by ocean clutter, confused by metal chaff, or absorbed by rain clouds. But the Pigeon relies on optical image recognition. It distinguishes the white foam of waves from the wake of a battleship. It identifies outlines under camouflage nets. In one extreme test, engineers even projected interference patterns onto the screen, shadows of flocking birds and clouds. A photoelectric sensor of the time would have been completely lost. But the Pigeon merely paused for a few milliseconds, seemingly thinking, and then decisively continued pecking the battleship. It ignored the noise and locked onto the signal. The report was sent to Washington. The conclusion was devastatingly clear. From the perspective of engineering and cybernetics, Project Pigeon is not only feasible, but its performance exceeds any known electronic device. The projected hit rate is over 98%. By all logic, this should have been the moment the champagne corks popped. This should have been the moment the military ordered mass production and Skinner became a war hero. But the logic of history is rarely decided by data. It is decided by human nature. Summer 1944. The final review meeting convenes in Washington. Sitting in the room are the core members of the National Defense Research Committee, including the famous Vannevar Bush, the architect of America's wartime science and the man behind the Manhattan Project. Skinner, brimming with confidence, turns on the projector. He shows slow-motion close-ups of Pigeon's pecking targets and the flawless test report from MIT. He points to a model of a target ship on the screen, repeatedly hit dead center. "Gentlemen," he says passionately, "this is the answer. We don't need to send our pilots to their deaths anymore. Give me 6 months, and I can give you 1,000 missiles with eyes." Silence falls over the conference room. Vannevar Bush doesn't look at the screen. He looks at Skinner with a complex expression, a mix of admiration and pity. "Professor Skinner," Bush finally speaks, his voice low. "This technology is impressive, but let me ask you a question. If we deploy this to the battlefield, and our field commanders open the maintenance hatch of the warhead and see 3 birds pecking at seeds, what do you think they will think?" Skinner freezes. What does that matter? As long as it sinks German battleships, who cares what's inside? They will care, an admiral cuts in, tapping the table with a tone of unconcealed absurdity. "War is serious, Professor. We cannot entrust the victory of the United States to a flock of poultry. Imagine the optics. What will the headlines say? US wins war with birds? It's a joke." This is the famous laugh factor. For these military men, accustomed to steel ships and thundering cannons, biological weapons, unless they were bacteria, were psychologically unacceptable. They could accept radar waveguides so complex no one understood them, because that was science, that was high-tech, that was the crystallization of human intellect. But pigeons? That was magic. That was a parlor trick. That was witchcraft. The deeper reason lay in the loss of control. The generals had a subconscious fear of living weapons. If a vacuum tube breaks, you replace it. If a wire snaps, you splice it. But what if the bird suddenly decides to quit? What if it mutinies? Even though the data proved the pigeon was far more reliable than a vacuum tube, the instinctive human distrust of non-human intelligence took the upper hand. At the same time, a powerful rival was quietly rising, sealing the fate of Project Pigeon. That rival was the rapid advancement of radar. While Skinner was defending his birds at MIT, in another lab next door, a radar-guided glide bomb codenamed the Bat was undergoing final tuning. Although it was massive, although its radar seeker was heavy and had low resolution, and although it cost 10 times as much as the Pelican, it was purely electronic. It was clean. It didn't need feeding. It didn't poop. It didn't raise bioethical questions. The Bat represented the direction of the American military-industrial complex. Replace men with complex machines, not with lower animals. It was the road to transistors, integrated circuits, and eventually, artificial intelligence. Skinner's biological computer, while incredibly cost-effective for its time, was a dead end on the technological tree. October 8, 1944. A cold official letter lands on Skinner's desk. It is short. No thanks. No commendation. Just bureaucratic rejection. In view of recent advances in electronic technology, the National Defense Research Committee considers further prosecution of the organic control system unnecessary. While the project met technical specifications, uncontrollable factors exist in combat application. The project is terminated immediately. Please dispose of all experimental animals and equipment. Skinner holds the letter, silent for a long time. Outside the window, wild pigeons land on the sill, cooing. Behind him in the lab, the 3 ace pigeons that scored perfect hits in the simulations, unaware they have just been fired, are still in their cages, excitedly waiting for the next mission, waiting for that screen to light up and drop food. It is a massive, tragic irony. Humanity used all its wisdom to build nuclear weapons capable of destroying the Earth and complex radar systems. But in 1944, there was actually no electronic device more precise than these pigeons. The US military preferred the expensive, inefficient scientific way over the cheap, efficient biological way, simply because the latter seemed too ridiculous to fit the dignity of humanity as the masters of creation. Months later, the Bat missile saw combat. Although it was the world's first autonomous guided missile, its performance was underwhelming. It was easily confused by ground clutter, often mistaking small islands for enemy ships. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Skinner's backyard, the pigeons that could have changed the course of World War II were sunbathing in a coop. Skinner later wrote bitterly in his memoirs, "Our problem was not the pigeons. The problem was that no one believed pigeons could do the job. We had the perfect hardware, the bird, and the perfect software, the conditioning, but we lost to human prejudice." This war between the physicist and the psychologist ended in total victory for the physicist. Hard tech defeated soft science. Electronic circuits defeated neural networks. This wasn't just the end of a project. It marked a choice of an era. Humanity decided to walk the path of purely mechanical, purely electronic intelligence, completely excluding biological entities from the core logic of the war machine. But did the story truly end there? On that night when the project was axed, Skinner didn't know that his crazy ideas hadn't completely died. They would linger like ghosts in the shadows of the Cold War, waiting for the next chance to be awakened. And next time, humanity would try to build something far more terrifying than a pigeon. On that cold autumn night in 1944, when Project Pigeon was officially sentenced to death, B.F. Skinner thought it was all over. The highly trained pigeons were discharged. The intricate servo simulators were dismantled. The blueprints were tossed into a cardboard box in the deepest recesses of the archives, stamped over and over with red ink, top secret and obsolete. But history loves a joke. Once an idea is born, it's hard to kill it completely. It simply waits for the next suitable host. Just 4 years later, in 1948, the smoke of World War II had barely cleared when the Iron Curtain fell. The chill wind of the Cold War blew through Washington. Faced with the growing military pressure of the Soviet Union, the Naval Research Laboratory dusted off those old files. To their surprise, they found that while electronic technology had advanced in those 4 years, in the key areas of pattern recognition and anti-jamming, the vacuum tube was still as dumb as a rock. And so, a project with a more obscure, sci-fi sounding name was quietly launched, Project Orkan. Orkan stood for Organic Control. Notice the shift. They no longer used the word pigeon, which sounded too biological. They used organic, a cold engineering term. This marked a total shift in military thinking. To them, this wasn't an animal anymore. It was wet, breathing hardware. This time, the research went deeper and got weirder. In the Navy lab, pigeons didn't look at film of the battlefield. They were used to guide anti-ship missiles by tracking a blip on a radar screen. It was a double layer of abstraction. Radar turned the battleship into a blip. The pigeon turned the blip into a pecking signal. The missile turned the signal into a trajectory of death. Test data once again proved Skinner's theory impeccable. In simulations, pigeons could continuously track a target moving at 400 miles per hour, with lightning-fast reaction times and zero fatigue. Even in the early 1950s, when the first transistors were appearing, the computational efficiency of these organic processors still crushed the most advanced electronic computers of the day. But in 1953, Project Orkan was cancelled for good. This time, what killed the pigeon wasn't just prejudice. It was a technological singularity. The infrared seeker of the Sidewinder missile had been successfully developed. Although it was like a blind fly that could only chase a heat source, it was simple, and it was electronic. More importantly, the solid-state revolution had begun. Transistors were getting smaller and more reliable. Engineers finally saw a possibility. We could build a missile's brain using silicon wafers and germanium crystals, instead of corn and feathers. Electronic devices weren't as smart as pigeons back then, but they had two advantages a pigeon could never match. First, they could sit on a shelf for 10 years without needing to be fed. Second, and most importantly, they didn't have a soul. Project Pigeon and Project Orkan ended up as footnotes in military history museums, a Stranger Things story people laugh about. Visitors point at the missile head stuffed with a pigeon and chuckle at the madness of that era. But if we stop laughing and look closely at this history, we find a chilling fact. Skinner didn't fail. He was just too early. The core concept he proposed, treating an intelligent entity as a black box and training it to recognize patterns through reward mechanisms, is the exact cornerstone of the artificial intelligence era we live in today, 70 years later. Look at our modern smart weapons. The Tomahawk cruise missile, the Predator drone, is the way their cameras lock onto targets fundamentally different from Skinner's pigeons? Skinner's pigeons relied on a neural network, a biological brain, trained by big data, thousands of feeding reinforcements, to learn to identify target features, the outline of a battleship, from a complex background. Isn't that deep learning? Is that not a convolutional neural network? When we train an AI to recognize a cat, we don't tell it a cat has 2 ears and a tail. We show it 1 million photos of cats and say, this is a cat. If it gets it right, we adjust the parameters, give it a digital reward. If it gets it wrong, we feed back the error. The mathematical essence of this logic is identical to Skinner feeding corn pellets to a bird. So, Skinner's pigeon missile was actually the first neural network-guided weapon in human history. The carrier just happened to be carbon-based biological neurons instead of silicon-based artificial ones. We spent half a century and burned hundreds of billions of dollars to finally reinvent their electronic pigeon. This history leaves us with more than just a technological revelation. It forces a profound reflection on war and human nature. The most uncomfortable part of Project Pigeon isn't the absurdity of the tech. It's the extreme objectification of life. In Skinner's lab, life was stripped of dignity and reduced to an input-output component. The pigeon wasn't a life. It was a capacitor, a resistor, a sensor in a circuit diagram. Once this logic starts, it doesn't stop at animals. In World War II, bombardiers looked through the Norden sight and humans on the ground became coordinates. In Vietnam, sensors dropped Agent Orange, and the jungle became a data zone. In modern warfare, drone operators sit in air-conditioned rooms thousands of miles away, watching pixels on a screen and pressing a button. A living human becomes a target signature to be deleted. Skinner's pigeon is a metaphor for the human condition in modern war. We are all pigeons in that sealed metal capsule. We view the world through screens, media, data, orders. We are trained by various reward mechanisms, salaries, medals, social approval. We peck frantically at the targets on our screens, thinking we are fulfilling some great mission, yet we often don't know the true meaning behind the orders, nor where our actions will guide this missile. The military ultimately rejected the pigeon because they felt delegating the serious business of killing to an animal was undignified. It was a hypocritical, anthropocentric arrogance. It seemed that a human pressing a button to kill another human was somehow more noble than letting a bird guide the bomb. But if the efficiency of killing is the only standard, what is the difference between a man, a bird, and an AI? The general who laughed in that MIT lab wasn't afraid of the pigeon's clumsiness. He was afraid of its perfection. If a trained bird could outperform a human ace pilot, what value was left for humans in war? Were the glory, courage, and sacrifice of a soldier just a biological algorithm that could be replaced? Today, when we discuss lethal autonomous weapon systems, laws, and whether AI should have the license to kill, we are repeating the argument from that night in 1944. We still fear the loss of control. We still worry whether that thing in the black box, biological or electronic, will one day betray us. At the end of the story, let's turn our gaze back to the pigeon codenamed Alpha. After the project was cancelled, Skinner didn't kill the birds. He took them home and kept them in a coop in his backyard. According to his memoirs, these pigeons kept their strange habits for a long time. Whenever they saw a specific triangular object or heard a sound like a jet engine, their necks would stiffen. Their eyes would sharpen instantly, snapping into a combat stance, ready to peck. That was the ghost of war etched into their neural circuits. They were a group of retired veterans, soldiers who never saw a battlefield but had lived through countless suicide missions deep in their souls. They cooed under the peaceful sun, but in their tiny heads, perhaps they were still endlessly chasing that battleship that would never sink. This is Project Pigeon, a story about madness, genius, arrogance, and lost possibilities. It tells us that technological progress is never a straight line. Scattered at the abandoned crossroads are often startling fragments of our own nature. In our quest to play God, we once tried to hire the devil. We even, once, hired a pigeon.